Millions of men and women and children were taken away from their place of birth, mostly from West Africa, and loaded onto slave ships as livestock. A place that was once the envy of Europe had become the hunting ground for cheap labor. Before forcing slaves on these vessels, many slaves had to walk hundreds of miles. These journeys were known as the death marches, as half of those who were captured did not survive. They were all shattered as they made their journey, this long journey indeed. Those who were too sick to move were left to die on this journey or killed. The thought that Europeans saw slavery as the right thing to do is frightening. However, what is more frightening is that the system of slavery was established by using laws. These laws were designed to use captives to maximize profit. Yes, profit from sugarcane. The more slaves reached the Caribbean, the more profit would be made. Let me say that again. The more slaves reached the Caribbean, the more profit would be made. The reality is that slave owners wanted to transport as many Africans to the Caribbean and the Americas so that their profit could be greater. The issue of human dignity was missing. After all, slaves were just livestock. While parts of history talks about slave ships and how the slaves were stacked, not often is the detail highlighted. And in this presentation, I want to clearly highlight how this was done. It is essential to note that how slaves were packed would be an indicator of how many would survive the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was a transition point from when the slaves left the fort in Africa to their transition to the Caribbean. Over time, slave traders had found two ways to pack slaves onto their ships. The first method was called loose pack. This meant that fewer slaves were placed on a ship. Reducing the number of slaves on a ship meant that more slaves would survive the journey. After all, slaves got more space to breathe, and the rate of illness was slightly less based on the distance per slave. In contrast, many captains believed that tight packing would increase productivity. In their perspective, the more slaves you packed on a ship would yield greater profit. The reality is that in many cases, more slaves died. However, captains went this route of tight packing. Let me say most of them. Regardless of the method used, the space was limited. Slaves were secure via chain for over 3 months on their journey. They were so close to each other that they were unable to relieve themselves using the toilet buckets provided. As a result, these slaves had to lay in their own mess, their own filth. Some records indicate that slaves were barely given enough room to breathe, much less to move. What a travesty indeed. The place that slaves stayed under the deck was not properly ventilated, thus it had a foul smell consistently. This meant that these ships were an incubator for disease. Many slaves jumped from these ships. Many of these slaves could not bear the cruelty, and as a matter of fact, some jumped overboard. Others decided that they would rather commit suicide. And as a matter of fact, some decided to take on the wicked crew. Based on records, it is estimated that 1 in every 5 slaves perished and did not survive the transatlantic slave trade. Slaves who died were thrown overboard. The Slave Trade Act of 1788, called the Dulbans Act, was put in place to regulate the conditions of slave vessels. The Prime Minister back then stated that it was very unfortunate to have slaves being transmitted over to the Caribbean like herrings stacked in a barrel. Under the regulations, captains were required to reduce the number of slaves per voyage and also take a doctor on board that would keep records regarding the slaves on the ship. However, it has been said that the policy was implemented to ensure that more slaves survived that journey to ensure maximized profit. When the weather permitted, slaves were forced onto the deck to exercise. If they did not, they were beaten. Based on records, slaves were also force-fed. Let us not forget the beat, the rape, as these slaves crossed the transatlantic. When we look back, we have to understand that slaves went through a lot, and there's no better way to hear from them, not from the perspective of the captain, but from their own perspectives. I will now highlight the narratives of two slaves as they traveled the Middle Passage. The first is Asa Asa, an enslaved African who arrived in the French West Indies. He describes the situation. The slaves we saw on board the ship were chained together by their legs below deck, so close that they could not move. They were flogged very cruelly. I saw one of them flogged until he died. We did not know what for. The place they were confined in below the deck was so hot and nasty, I could not bear it. A great many of the slaves were ill, but they were not attended to. They used to flog me very badly on the ship. The captain cut my head very badly one time. The work of Equiano also highlights the horrific nature of this journey. In his narrative, Equiano gives an account of the horrific conditions he experienced. He stated that below the deck of the ship was hot and overcrowded. He always felt he would die from suffocation, and the buckets used to collect slaves' waste was always overflowing with children covered in the bodily waste. In closing, let me say that we must revisit our history. We must understand where we're coming from, and we must understand without history, we cannot guide the younger generation. Too often, I've seen where people do not understand the historical connections. Hence, they make very irrational decisions. I am Ruhan Jawala, and that's all for now.